The joke that I tell people is that if you're comparing the auction specialist and the gallery senior director, the senior director is more keen to like a domesticated Persian cat that does not want you to touch it, does not want to be petted, just wants you to feed it and just walk away, no eye contact. They couldn't care less about you. They genuinely could not, and you feed them. Whereas the auction house specialist is like like a shelter animal, like a shelter dog. Anything, anything to get your attention, anything to get your attention. And that really kind of sums it up pretty neatly.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the MO Podcast, where we explore projects of grand ambition in the art world and cultural sector. I'm your host, Joey Flores, here with my co-host, Jonathan Neal. Our guest today is a dear friend of mine, Shlomi Rabi. In addition to being an Emmy Award winner, Shlomi has over 20 years of experience in the auction world with notable roles leading the photography departments at Christie's and Phillips. In 2020, he founded Greenhouse Auctions, an innovative auction platform designed for the primary market with a strong focus on diversity and social justice. In 2021, just 1.5 years later, Shlomi sold the platform to Artsy, where he became their global head of auction sales. Shlomi, welcome to the show.
I am delighted to be here. Thank you very much for having me, Joey and Jonathan.
Yeah, we're super excited to have you here. This is going to be a fun one. Shlomi, so we will talk today a lot about the art and auction markets, of course, but while I was fact-checking my introduction remarks earlier today, I noticed for the first time ever that you previously won an Emmy. Can you elaborate on that for us? Look at that thing. There it is. Tell us about that.
Of course. So I used to live in Chicago for 6 years. And in 2006, I was contacted by an individual named Marcus Riley, who was coming from NBC Universal in New York to Chicago to start a very radical new initiative in Chicago called live blogging. And the idea was that instead of waiting a whole week to get your Time Out Chicago in the mail, you could just go on the site and read about everything that is happening. And the content was being delivered by everyday Chicagoans like myself. And so I was covering arts and culture and some LGBTQ related events. And it was wonderful. I had a fabulous time. It was completely pro bono. And in 2008, we were nominated for an Emmy. And the category was Outstanding Achievement in Alternate Media. That's a mouthful. And we won. We won for our coverage of specifically Looptopia, which is an annual arts and culture event that happens in Chicago, where everything shuts down from traffic shuts down from 5 p.m. to 5 a.m. downtown, and all businesses open. And you have live street performances, singers, acting groups, musicians, jugglers, everything you could possibly imagine, sprawled all over downtown. And a handful of us covered that event, and we were nominated for an Emmy. And on October 18th, 2008, which was also the night of my 30th birthday, we won the Emmy. So there you have it.
That's a hell of a birthday night. Did you go to the award show?
Yes. So not the fancy one that you see on television. That was the one for journalism, which was still it was a black tie event. It was very nice, but it was not televised. So you didn't get to see my mug on TV, sadly.
Well, that's unfortunate for the rest of the world.
October of 2008 was a very interesting moment, right? Because the markets were basically in free fall for the month prior, and I think that was really the sort of front end, the front waves of what became the global financial crisis. So what was the feeling in the room as you were celebrating this Emmy and this period of coverage?
Cautious. We could tell that something was brewing, and it started, of course, with Lehman Brothers and turned into this domino effect. And I would say that we didn't realize the gravity of it until November, the November auctions. Now, at the time, I was working for a small regional auction house, called Suzanne's Auctions. It's no longer around. And we were building up our big annual auction for December. And as we were building that up, we could tell that the mood was changing. By that point, the auctions in New York were collapsing. A lot of businesses were closing. And a lot of guaranteed works put the auction houses in the red because people were not going to jump in at full price. And the December auction that we had was a flop, sadly. And as a result, I was made redundant in January of 2009. So I certainly felt the echo of that.
The immediate effect,
but,
right?
Yes, very much so. And I started working as an appraiser, and then the opportunity at Phillips, New York came up. And I figured, why not? I did a Hail Mary. I didn't think they would go for someone who lived in Chicago, but here we are.
Nice. Yeah, because I recall that I think it was mid-September, sometime in the first couple of weeks of September, was the Damien Hirst blockbuster, beautiful inside my head, forever, direct to auction house sale, which was itself a kind of, I think the pinnacle of art market exuberance and of artists who had kind of made the market their medium, and this steaming moment of a kind of juggernaut of the high level, of the high net worth individual collecting class being able to go cut out the galleries and go straight to the consumer through the major auction houses. And then and then within a couple of weeks it was close to the end of the world for many of those same people.
That is very, very true. I mean, which is why we haven't seen an auction like that since then. I think the idea of flooding a market is something that everyone would take much more seriously now, because Damien Hirst prices definitely took a plunge after that. And it wasn't just a recession. I think when much of a good thing will leave everyone with, a sore tooth. So I think that's what happened. And I really don't think that he's reached the height of that since then. Again, he's been very prolific. He'll be just fine. That was a $200 million sale.
Right.
No need to start a GoFundMe for Damien.
Exactly. Unless he becomes the Johnny Depp of the art world, right? Like, you figure out that he's got a, $50,000 a week wine habit or something like that, in which case, you might want to feel sorry for him again.
No, we're good. We're good. But I mean, he is too big to fail, and there are a number of artists like that who have, the blue chip gallery representation. Too many people have invested in them to let them to have their prices completely drop all the way. So there might be a 50% discount from where it was back in the day, but they'll never let it really truly fall, because again, they're far too invested in the artist market.
Yeah, and also, I mean, it is the case that Hirst has a role to play in the history books of post-2000s contemporary art, part of the YBA movement, certainly the kind of poster boy for that entire kind of run up in the art market for the late 90s into the early 2000s. And there's no going back from that. I mean, I think that, and there's some interesting work that was made, and there was a lot of interesting discourse. So the work doesn't go to zero, but I agree with you. There has been a kind of overproduction and an overinvestment, and perhaps some over leveraging in a single artist's world, and it might take some time for that to flush out of the system. But I can see it already, that there will be some 20 years from now retrospective for Damien at the Tate Modern or wherever it's going to be, because he had a role to play.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, his relevance is not diminished.
Do you think any artist today looms quite as large, or has the capacity to loom that large? Or do you think that the structural conditions of both the art world and the market have shifted so as not to allow a similar type of domination?
It's a really good question. I mean, there are certainly a number of contemporary artists who are commanding seven figures at auction. I don't think anyone is in danger of becoming that. I think lessons have been learned, and a lot of dealers are a lot more cautious about getting their artists to overproduce. I think now it's more about finding the right um, patron for these works, the right museum, the right collector, the right trustee that will be a good sort of steward for the piece and not necessarily creating this massive volume just to satiate the needs on the market. So there are a number of artists, Mark Grogan, Mark Bradford, so many of them that have done incredibly well. Julie Moretu, Cecily Brown, where per piece anywhere between 5 and 15 million, but you're really not going to see that kind of like excessive, borderline vulgar consumption of art by any given artist. I don't think anytime soon.
It's interesting because the return to a kind of institutional patron and authority to keep that in check or to manage the sort of public aura around those artists is coming at the exact moment when many of these institutions, as well as these patrons, are coming under increasing scrutiny for their practices, for their type of gatekeeping, for where the money comes from and what the money is being used for in terms of supporting the arts and cultural institutions that the various different trustees are affiliated with. So I'm curious if you think that there'll be a sort of, if there's a tension involved there, if that's a kind of strategic move. I've got my own opinions, but I'm curious to hear what you think about that.
Sure. I think that the art world, especially the primary market, is the only industry that I can think of that really doesn't want to grow its base audience. It's kind of whack. It's you have people who are willing to come in and buy and they promise to be good collectors, and yet our world goes to great lengths to alienate them, to be intimidating, to make the entry point incredibly high and unwelcoming. It's wild. It's absolutely wild. And I don't see that changing anytime soon. And that level of, or that sort of relationship with patronage will probably continue as well, so that there is an over vetting of clients. You have to prove that you already own something of value for them to deem you worthy. And even then, you might just be on a wait list for 3 years. That's the reason why auctions are so popular, because they're incredibly democratic and everyone gets a fair shot.
The way you describe it makes the auction system sound much more populist in its nature than the primary market of, say, the dealer, gallery, advisor, art fair system, which is in some ways inherently more elitist on that description in terms of much more gatekeeping in terms of who its consumers can be and how it tries to cultivate value for the artists. It's an interesting divide, because I think a lot of people would like look at Sotheby's and Christie's and Phillips as playgrounds of the elite, right? Like that's not necessarily a sort of a democratic environment as you describe it, but in comparison, it's true.
Absolutely. And listen, there's a lot of new money, right? There's a lot of tech money, there's a lot of startup money, and they're really wonderful people who are, especially from a younger generation, from, I would say, millennials and even some Gen Zs, who are very keen to enter, but they just find the whole thing too stuffy, too snooty. They just want to see it online, bid online. They don't want to meet anyone. But the joke that I tell people is that if you're comparing the auction specialist and the gallery senior director, the senior director is more keen to like a domesticated Persian cat that does not want you to touch it, does not want to be petted, just wants you to feed it and just walk away, no eye contact. They couldn't care less about you. They genuinely couldn't, and you feed them. Whereas the auction house specialist is like like a shelter animal, like a shelter dog. Anything to get your attention, anything to get your attention. And that really kind of sums it up pretty neatly. They're both loved for different reasons, but that's how starkly different they are in their approach. You go to an auction house, and within 3 seconds, like a genie, a specialist will just show up out of the ground, introduce themselves, give you their card, ask you for yours, follow you around, take notes, follow up, and they'll really want you to feel included.
There's no question that the auctions are there to develop as many bidders, as many potential purchasers of the work as they possibly can, right? And there's often with the gallery system, it's a very different idea, right? I mean, they are in the business of sales, and refreshingly, I think there are a handful of gallerists who have come out more recently to state that, their job really is to sell their artists' work. Whereas, 10, 15, 20 years ago, it was a very different relationship that galleries believe they have to their artists in terms of developing careers and maintaining value and making sure that they were able to speak for and develop a discourse around an artist's entire oeuvre and what have you. I think that's still important, and it's still the case. And there are many galleries who do that, and I think do it well. But we know that the marketplace is a very different animal these days and requires a very different type of attitude in terms of making sure that the revenue is there both for the gallery and for the artist.
Absolutely. And of course, the gallery will never say that they sell. They place works with collectors, and they will never sell to a buyer. They only sell to collectors. Of course, now that the economy is not doing too great, all of them are hurting. They're like, where can we get more clients? I was like, well, if you had been a little bit more receptive, if you had done more to market to a younger audience and actually cultivated it, you probably wouldn't be in this pickle, but you've curated your list of people that you want to sell to. And as a result, you're finding yourself in this position. So I think there will be some kind of recalibration once we come out of this slump, for sure.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think it was interesting, the idea of new collectors, or let's say sort of less seasoned collectors or purchasers for art, going to the auction houses first. Today, given the state of the market, there's a lot of very good, very interesting work that is coming online particularly during the day sales. It may not be, blue chip marquee work that is the, 7-figure or even 8-figure stuff. But there's work by very well-known artists, some very good works on paper, some very good smaller scale things that if you like an artist's work, you can get for relatively reasonable pricing, especially compared to some of the primary market material or to what those artists' work go for out of their galleries.
Shlomi, that seems like a good segue into what we would call the magnum opus part of our MO podcast. So you built Greenhouse Auctions. Tell us the story, like leading to you starting Greenhouse Auctions, and specifically, I also want to know, as a first-time founder of a company, like what gave you the confidence, or dare I say, hubris, to start a company?
I can answer the last question very quickly with one word: wine. I had too much wine when I made that decision, and I was committed to it, so I had to follow it through. But we'll get to that in a second. So what led to that was I've been working in the auction world for my entire career, right? And I was at one big auction house, and I received an offer from a competing big auction house. And because I was going from to a direct competitor, I had 6 months of non-compete. That was November of 2019. I was scheduled to start on May 18th of 2020. As we know, a global pandemic, happened, and my job offer was rescinded the day before I was scheduled to start. So May 18th was a Monday. On Friday morning, I just got a call from the head of HR saying we have to rescind the offer. And so wine came into play that weekend. And that's what gave me the confidence and the hubris to go ahead. And by end of day Tuesday the 19th, I filed the LLC with the state of New York, the certificate of publication with the state of New York. I received my tax code, bought the domain names, and I just got to work. I think, to be very clear, I never thought of myself as an entrepreneur. I never thought that I would ever start my own business, let alone my own auction house. It's something that I had hypothetically played with, like by seeing what was not going well at other houses. I kind of took mental notes of what if I were running the place, I would be doing. But there was never really an initiative on my part to run with that. But the world was so topsy-turvy, and I figured that I would lean into that, into the fact that all the auction houses didn't know when they're going to have their next big auctions. The contemporary sales, which are traditionally May, but then got kicked down the road to July, I believe. And they didn't know if people will bid online. And there are so many uncertainties, and I decided to sort of lean into those uncertainties and take everything that I loved from the auction world, which is a very democratic approach to participation, price transparency, sell by date, pay by date, so no hemming and hawing for 3 months if you want something or not, but really combine it with the ethos of the primary market, of not publishing the final price so that if something doesn't sell, it doesn't burn the piece. And if something oversells, it doesn't encourage people to go ahead and flood the market. There was a 5-year no resale restriction, and right of first refusal, so that if a collector wanted to sell the work after a number of years, they would first have to go to the artist and their gallery before they could do so. And, it was a very idealistic approach. And I think because I didn't know just how little I understood about, starting a business, that I had the confidence to go ahead and do it. It's good that I didn't know how incredibly difficult starting a business is, how challenging it is to hear no all the time. 99% of the people whom I reached out to said no. Some were very nice about it. Some were very rude about it. And you have to keep moving forward. It's a good thing, again, that I didn't know what I didn't know, because it was a beautiful discovery process. Yes, there were challenges to that, but I've come out of it so much more empowered and confident and with a set of skills that I wouldn't have had otherwise. I would say in that year and a half, I probably grew more as a business person than I had in the previous 20. One of the amazing advantages of being an entrepreneur is that you're connected to other entrepreneurs. And that's where I met Joey. We had a really good friend named Lydia who used to work with Joey. And she said, I just want to connect you to this guy. I used to work with him. He has dreads. He's a lot of fun and he's super smart. And I met with Joey, and at first I thought he was very sharky. And I was like, I don't know if that's the right vibe. I know, now that I know him, yeah, I would be laughing too. But we kept on connecting, and it was this beautiful synergy. And you realize that not only were you separated at birth, but you actually think very similarly in how you want to change the art world and build bridges and bring people alternatives. And I realized with the work that I was doing at Greenhouse that people were really, really keen on finding new avenues. If I can use the simplest word that I can think of, it was a really beautiful moment, I would say. And you could argue that because the pandemic was so wild that people were open to these new ideas. And I don't know if today Greenhouse would be as successful, if I'm being very honest, just because there's so much more red tape and a lot of people have sort of gone back to their previous way of thinking. But I would like to think of it as, I don't know if you've seen the movie Awakening, when they find this drug that is allowing people who had been comatose for a long time to suddenly reconnect with the world and reconnect with each other. But then the effects of the drugs wear off and they all go back to being in a vegetative state. That's kind of what it was like in some ways. And here we are now.
I think that's hilarious. I actually had it on my list here, Shlomi, to ask you how we met and what your first impression of me was, because I know that story.
When you launched the auction house, it's a two-sided market. You've got to bring suppliers, artists to the platform. You have to bring buyers, collectors to the platform. What was the biggest challenge in those first days, weeks, months in terms of finding artists to get onto the platform, or also ensuring that there's a big enough pool of buyers to help support what was there?
That's a great question. So the biggest challenge was getting the supply, because I knew that having spent by that point, 20 years in the art world, I had enough contacts who would be interested at the very least. And I was also spending a chunk of change on PR and getting the word out. And that was probably my biggest expense after building the website, of course. And so it was getting the supply, and a lot of people just didn't want to be the first ones for obvious reasons. For a lot of them, it was too much of a risk. But I found that the ones who are at the very least willing to have a conversation, there was a very strong conversion rate with those. Because they got to know me and they got to understand that I was coming from a very ethical place and I wanted to promote their work and champion their work. Another big seller with artists as a way of getting them to participate was not charging them commission. I said, if it doesn't sell, no harm, no foul. There'll be first of all, there's not going to be a public record of it not selling, and you're not going to owe me anything. And if it does sell, we're only going to charge you 5% commission in comparison with, 50%, which is what the gallery would charge them. Only a 5% commission, and that 5% would entirely get donated to a new scholarship fund for art and art history students in publicly funded HBCUs. And we teamed up with the Thurgood Marshall College Fund, which is the largest administrator of scholarships for publicly funded HBCUs in the country, 47 of them. And they were very, very keen to work with us. And they said, this is great. We only have a lot of the money that we get from corporations goes to STEM students, not really art. We don't really have a single scholarship for students in art or the arts. So dance, art history, painting, theater, they didn't have any. So that was the first one of its type. And telling that story to the artist, saying, whatever we get from you is going to go to that scholarship. So we make no money off of you. We make our money from the buyer. We make no money off of you. Whatever we make off of you will go to support the artist. They loved that because it empowered them and it made them feel like they were doing something very philanthropic. And we ended up, doing very well. We raised a nice chunk of change for the Thurgood Marshall College Fund. And I continued that model once I sold the business to Artsy, and we continued that scholarship for another year. But it's crazy to think that to this day, it's the only scholarship that has ever specifically targeted art or students in the arts in publicly funded HBCUs. So there was a way to make the artists feel more included in the benefits of participating in the auction that was critical, I think, to getting them to sign on. But the struggle was real. For every artist who said yes, 100 said no.
Right, because auctions historically have this really negative cast on the part of the artists, right? I mean, I remember talking to a friend of mine who's a painter in New York, and he's like, you realize that like the things that we make are like our children, and then when you see them go up for sale on the secondary market, when they show up at these auction houses, there's this pit in your stomach about, oh, this thing is now being cast adrift, and what is going to happen to it, and who's going to pick it up, and how is it going to live in the world going forward, totally outside of my control. Not to mention all of the kinds of not price manipulations, but let's say the exacerbations and the things that can happen to an artist market when there's constrained supply, and then work shows up at auction and can go for astronomical amounts, which creates pricing that's all out of whack between secondary and primary market. And then the reverse, when a work goes up and things seem to be the hot artist in the primary market, and then the stuff on the secondary market doesn't find a buyer, and you realize that something was really hyped on somewhere else. But I really appreciate what you said about the incentive for the artist too, because I think that there's artists, regardless of wanting to join a sort of auction platform, they need to justify their actions to other artists. And so having a philanthropic component, or having that hook, which basically says, listen, I'm doing this, it is an auction platform, but the commission goes to this scholarship fund, and that makes it a really easy choice to be able to do it. They can convince themselves. I mean, many of them are like, listen, I want to do this. I want to be able to sell more work. I want to be able to connect with more buyers of my work. That all sounds great. But when they're sitting down across from drinks with other artists at an opening or somewhere else, and they're talking about doing this, they need something else to be able to talk about, because they can't just say that I want to do this in order to sell my work. They can say I'm doing this because it's got
Mm-hmm.
this goodness
Mm-hmm.
attached to it, right? And if they can justify it to somebody else, and somebody else is like, oh yeah, totally, I can totally see why you would do that, then it's okay. It's a really interesting
Mm-hmm.
social dynamic that drives those kinds of decisions.
Yes, artists influence each other much more so than any other demographic.
Hugely.
Which is beautiful. But a lot of the artists that I got at Greenhouse were through other artists who were
Yeah.
keen on participating. That's really how I got many, especially the ones who did well at auction. Because there's a certain level of comfort that comes when your friend is doing it as well.
Shlomi, because you're talking about artists quite a lot in this moment, I was going to save this question for later, but I'll drop it now. What's something that you think most emerging artists either get wrong or don't know about the art market? Like, what's a secret of the art market, or a misconception that you think most emerging artists have about success in the art market?
That I would say for a lot of artists, emerging artists, that is, the number one mistake is seeing what sells well and trying to create something similar. I would say that's probably the biggest mistake, not finding their own language and just mimicking someone else's accent, if you will, not to overextend the metaphor, is something that usually is a non-starter. And they'll have a very difficult time finding gallery representation. Gallery representation is key. It doesn't have to be Gagosian who represents you right off the bat. A lot of all the big artists that we can think of who are working today, who are in their 50s and 60s, started off at small little galleries on the Lower East Side in Brooklyn. Those are the galleries that emerging artists tend to dismiss because, like, oh, it's too small. I need more people to know about my work. The art world is very small. Everybody goes to each other's openings. Big directors from major galleries always scout the smaller galleries for new talent, for emerging talent. But the number one thing is find what it is that makes you unique. That is what's going to ultimately sell you to a gallery. So I would say maybe two things, right? One is finding your own voice and making sure that you are consistent and building a body of work that reflects that. And the second is dismissing smaller galleries. Some of the artists who are also doing very well now are not even showing in New York. They are actually pretty insistent on showing in smaller galleries around the country because they don't want to oversaturate their market. They don't want to have one of their pieces show up at a Christie's day sale and flop and then have everyone all of a sudden panic that they overpaid for it. They want to sort of be consistent and under the radar, and you can have a very, very, very successful artist without ever having a single one of your pieces come up for auction or be represented by a mega gallery. Absolutely.
That's great. I want to jump back to Greenhouse for a second. I think when I first started Earbits, I had a pretty clear idea of the dream outcome that I wanted. I'm curious, maybe you didn't have one right away, maybe you did, but like, what was the outcome you were hoping for with Greenhouse, and like, how do you feel about where the story ended?
Another good question. To be honest, I didn't want to sell. The big vision, the pie in the sky, the desired outcome was for Greenhouse to continue just growing and becoming a new path for people to collect art and for people to sell art. And I just wanted more of everything. The outcome of selling it was, listen, I'm not complaining about it. Very happy with how that turned out, but that was never really the goal, if I'm being super honest. Like, I just wanted Greenhouse to live forever. It was my baby. And I had never believed more in a business. To this day, it's my favorite business of all time. Again, maybe because it was so wholesome, and maybe if I were tried to scale it, it would have become, as corrupt as the other larger businesses. But it was just a small, beautiful little moment in time that had its moment. And the decision to sell was when honestly, it was a lot. It was a lot because I didn't have employees. I had freelancers, phenomenally talented freelancers, but I didn't have employees. It was a very lonely environment. I think being an entrepreneur is highly romanticized in this country. When you have shows like Shark Tank that make it seem like, the little folksy, couple in Texas that had this great idea that then sells for $5 million. That's a fantasy. That is the antique roadshow of the business world. It's a fantasy. Those are anomalous. For every business that makes it, there's a gajillion that didn't. And I think that the loneliness of it all is highly underemphasized. And it's considered a sacrifice to fulfilling your dream. And to me, there was at a certain point, I wanted to have colleagues. I wanted to have the security of a paycheck. I wanted to have health insurance. Who knew? I didn't feel like I needed to be a martyr and stick it all the way until it became huge. I wanted, honestly, not to sound super cliche, but I wanted to have more of a balance, right? Because I was working all the time. Even when I wasn't working, I was working. You never really go on vacation because you're always working. You work on the craziest hours. You put so much into these moments, into these tiny pockets called auctions. And if they don't go as you'd hope, that's like 3 months of work that hasn't paid for itself. And it's incredibly crushing. And when it's your own business, you feel it a lot more when it's someone else's. So the decision to sell was a very practical one. And I noticed that there was a lot of synergy between what I was doing and what Artsy was doing. And I knew that Artsy had started out as essentially a marketplace for galleries, primary and secondary, but primarily primary market galleries, to be showing their artists and to expose them to a much larger audience. And for me, that was just a very simple, a very smooth way to dovetail into what they were doing. So I reached out to them and I said, this is what you're doing, right? You work with thousands of primary market galleries. What I do is build auctions for primary market galleries. If you're to even take 1% of the artists or of the artworks that you have listed on your site, that could be a huge source of revenue for you. And I would be happy to spearhead that. And they like that. And they brought me on board and they asked me to run all of their auctions globally. So it was their partnerships with other auction houses, their charity auctions, secondary market auctions, and I introduced the primary market auctions. And it was the same model as Greenhouse. You get to connect the buyer and the seller. There was a certain percentage that went to support the Thurgood Marshall College Fund scholarship, the 5-year no resale restriction. Then we started teaming up with Fairchain as a way of registering the transactions on blockchain and securing that the artist would be getting paid royalties for any subsequent sales in perpetuity. It was wonderful. I absolutely loved it. We called them impact auctions because that's exactly what they were, social impact auctions. And some of them were, $500 pieces. And we went all the way to almost $1 million with a Stanley Whitney and Gagosian Gallery. So we really got to open it up for dozens and dozens and dozens of artists that would not have had that exposure otherwise. And it's still ongoing. I'm incredibly proud of that.
Shlomi, I'm curious, what do you think culturally Artsy wants to be, and what do you think is stopping them from becoming that?
Could you rephrase or be more specific about what you mean by culturally?
Maybe it's just the CEO or what have you, but what do you think? Not necessarily what is Artsy doing and being. They're obviously a massive art marketplace, right? And maybe that's all they have the aspirations to do. But I think a lot of times, you have, as an entrepreneur or CEO or whatever, you have like a bigger vision for what you'd like to achieve. And I think oftentimes there's a moral or ethical or, spiritual component to it, something that some goodness that you want to be in the world. Do you think that there is a side of Artsy that wants to be more than what Artsy is?
Mm-hmm, absolutely. I think especially for any business that's been around. They've been around for 12 years, I want to say, and they're still considered a startup in certain circles. There is definitely the aspiration, especially when you can smell it. It's so close to become the marketplace of like Amazon, right? That if you want to find an artist, any artist, and you can be in Bora Bora or Zimbabwe or Brooklyn, and you just go on the app and you type in the name of the artist, or you just search by category, and you find the artist, the price is listed, you hit buy, everything is automated from that point on, and it just shows up at your doorstep a couple of weeks later. I think that is the vision. I can't say that for a fact because I'm no longer at Artsy, and while I was there, I was not the CEO. But that is my general take. It's a very beautiful way of saying let's make art very democratic. Let's make it so accessible that you can buy it on your app. That you don't need to go and do the whole song and dance at a gallery to prove that you're a good person and that you bought other artists. No, you make it accessible for everyone and anyone with a credit card and a smartphone. I think that is the ultimate vision.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Listening to you talk about the practicality of selling the company and, the sort of wanting to sort of reclaim balance and other things like that. But, also wishing that the company had just gone on to be, a massive organization that could do, the same good you were already doing, but at scale. I'm curious if somebody were to hand you $5 million today to start greenhouse auctions all over again, but you had to really, really swing for the fences. I'm curious if you think that there's a huge outcome there to be had, and would you take the money and give it a shot?
I would take the money and give it a shot because I realized that for Artsy, and keep in mind the greenhouse model has been replicated since then. Sotheby's had their, whatever, I forget what they called it, but their primary market auctions where they literally replicated the model. It was a lower buyer's premium. There was no public result, blah, 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 blah. And then Hauser and Wirth replicated that as well. And then Simone de Pieri replicated that as well. So what I would do differently is that I would probably turn it into a hub for just benefit auctions, because the benefit auction market, I think, is highly prized, and there is a lot of money to be had there. So I would probably combine it into the social impact auctions and empower artists. And I see that, especially having learned from all the mistakes that I made previously, I see that becoming a scalable business, because there is no such thing as institutions having too much money and they don't want to raise more. No, and there's also no such thing as artists having too much money and not wanting to make more. So I think there's definitely a much more wholesome way of having benefit auctions, and that sort of would be the premise of Greenhouse Auctions 2.0. But yeah, I would take the money and I would start it for sure.
It's interesting because that became, I think, the linchpin of Paddle 8 when it kind of got its feet underneath it. It pivoted in a couple different directions, but I think by the time it really kind of found its métier was becoming the go-to platform for all the various different benefit auctions for the various different nonprofits, especially the ones that have always been affiliated with the art world, as well as the art organization benefit auctions themselves, right? Even outside of that. And then, Paddle 8 had its own kind of sort of what's subliming into the ether, and not to be any longer, but no one has really picked that up as a specialty. And I agree, it does seem to, people still want to do those auctions. There's still an appetite for it. They still happen. And the fact that there isn't somebody who has wrapped that up and made it efficient and discoverable and is able to create a larger audience for it is probably a pretty good idea for someone who's looking for a new business.
Yeah, absolutely. I think with Paddle 8, and actually I know one of the founders of Paddle 8, as well as a couple of their first employees, it started out as something very different.
Very different, yeah.
Very, very, initially it was just going to be this wonderful educational platform with these beautiful essays on the artworks that they were selling. And then they brought on benefit auctions, which were massively profitable and successful. And they really kind of changed the game when it came to benefit auctions and online auctions. They were really the first ones to start selling
Right.
works for figures. Up
Right.
until then, people thought of online as, eBay, and they were the
Right.
first ones to really change that. I never worked there. These are just my opinions.
Yeah.
But my impression was that they probably tried to take on too much. And instead of just focusing on the thing itself that made them all the money, I think they wanted to become more. They wanted to become a marketplace. They wanted to have secondary market sales.
Right.
And they just couldn't compete with the existing models for secondary market and for marketplaces. And that's all I can say. But the component itself was incredibly profitable for them.
Yeah, no, and actually, as a spectator of these various different art businesses, it's a great lesson in when you're an entrepreneur and an entrepreneurial team of needing to pivot into an area that's going to work. Because like you, I remember the sort of very first days when it was first pitched to me and my business partner at the time. We had an advisory business in New York City. And looking back at it now, it was the first attempt to create a kind of influencer curatorial marketplace, right? I mean, they would go to specific curators and then people outside of the art world and have these A-list names from other creative fields, musicians, designers, be the ones to pull together a list of artists and works that they were really into, and then to use that as a kind of marketing mechanism in order to sell work. And this is pre-Instagram days. And so, there was something there. The idea was right. The technology was trailing behind the idea. And in order for that to really take off, it couldn't be a website. You had to wait for a mobile platform to be created that, Instagram would allow it. And then it would do it without someone really being able to do it curatorially. It would just happen based on the algorithm. But, by the time they sort of figured it out and got around to doing the benefit auctions and everything else, at that point, it was like, wow, they really, they started off at A and they made it over to D, and D is working, and more power to them, right? Like that's the way to make that business work.
Yep. Absolutely. And they made auctions sexy and hip and young and cool.
Great design, great platform, great user experience. Yeah.
Absolutely. Like one of the first auctions that they had, or I think it might have even been like a selling exhibition that turned into an auction, was working with Robin Williams and his son, R.I.P. Robin Williams, and his son, who was like a hipster about town. And then, of course, they hired the Princess Eugenie or Princess Beatrice, one of them from England, an actual princess. And it wasn't a vanity hire. From what I understand, she was excellent at what she was doing, and she was very kind and down to earth, but she certainly brought a level of intrigue and cachet to Paddle 8. So they really did things differently, and they did everything right at the beginning. And a lot of the work that they've done has sort of been, different components have been adopted by different auction houses and different platforms, including Artsy for that matter, that live on.
Yeah. So I want to follow up on that a little bit and broaden that. When I think about it, the kind of the influencer marketing model, the idea of bringing in more overexposed people and names to validate artists and artwork. And then Paddle 8 did it on the flip side too, where working with the benefit auctions, you had access to much higher caliber work than you might otherwise be able to get your hands on because it was being validated through these various different nonprofit organizations that have always been very close to artists' hearts. And so, you would have a Robert Longo and a Rachel Harrison that you could get access to, but it's because it had been donated to a specific organization in order to raise funds for that organization. Otherwise, those names were never going to necessarily come up in a marketplace like that. But so on both sides, you had a kind of name, a platform that was using name recognition in order to sell the value of the work, the underlying work, right, and the value of the platform. That has not changed entirely. It seems like in some respects, the art market has moved even more in that direction, that it's become reliant on platforms, on Instagram, on followers, on visibility. Part of that has become more democratized because more people have access to the tools of exposure than they might have had before. But it seems also very apparent that there's a drive towards a kind of, and I hesitate to use this word, but I think that it makes sense, a kind of celebrity culture, if not celebrities themselves, of the art market. Do you see that as salutary for the artwork? Do you see that as creating challenges going forward? What's your opinion on the kind of celebrity dynamic and influencer dynamic that has come into play within the art market in a larger way over the last decade?
I'm a big fan. I think anything that can be done to democratize the art world and to make it more accessible, especially to the younger generation, is great. Swiss Beats curating an auction, Russell Tovey curating an auction, Venus Williams, all these individuals who one might not necessarily immediately associate with being a collector, although all of them are phenomenal collectors, for them to speak to a completely different demographic that would have never really thought about going to an auction is wonderful, because they do provide a certain bridge that hadn't existed before. Like, the art world is so insular and so self-referential, and those individuals who have a very sort of like pop culture influence, aura, presence, whatever you want to call it, are bringing a lot of really great young blood into this ecosystem. You also find that with auctions of celebrity stuff, because again, Freddie Mercury at Sotheby's, people were paying stupid, crazy sums of money just because it belonged to Freddie Mercury. And people who had never bid before were bidding and participating just because of that, and realized that it is open to everyone, and it is fun, and it is great when you walk away with something without having to ask for the price, without having to wait, without having to find out if you're on the waiting list or not. That there's a much more immediate satisfaction. So I'm personally very, very much in favor of anything that makes the art world more accessible and brings in a new generation, because frankly, this new generation is not as interested in collecting art or supporting the arts. They probably think of it as a little bit bougie. They very much support experiences and social causes. But buying art just for art's sake is something that doesn't click with them as much as it does with boomers and Gen X. So there are certainly challenges to that, but those type of opportunities are really great marketing moments to, again, provide a new entry point for a lot of folks that otherwise would not have been interested in the art world.
Well, Shlomi, we're a little over time here, but we have another segment we call, so again, this is the MO podcast. We have the More Opinions segment. We're going to ask you some really random questions to wrap up the episode here. So the first one is what we would call the major ovation question, which is what's a person or project in the creative fields or cultural sector that you admire?
Okay. So I would say I'm going to go a little bit rogue and say that it's actually not a business, but it's more of an advocacy platform called the Art Funders Forum. And it was started by Sean McManus and Brett Dobbs, and Melissa Cowley Wolf is the director. She was actually my connection. She is my connection to the Art Funders Forum. And what they do is they work on educating people on why they should care about investing in the arts, and why there should be a lot more philanthropy among individuals. There is actually somewhat of a crisis among art and culture institutions of people not giving anymore. The generation that, the baby boomers and the silent generation that gave so much, they're not really seeing that level of enthusiasm replicated. Some of the younger philanthropists are preferring to donate to um, education to environmental causes, and that's incredibly noble, but not enough goes into supporting the arts, and the Art Founders Forum does exactly that. There's no transaction to be had, but the work that they do is incredibly important and crucial in this day and age. So I had to give them a shout out.
I love it because what people don't know is that you introduced me to Melissa Cowley Wolf 3.5 years ago, and Melissa Cowley Wolf introduced me to Jonathan. So without Art Funders Forum and Melissa Cowley Wolf, we would not be here today.
Wow.
Doing this podcast. So that's pretty remarkable. I'm excited that you gave them a shout out. That they do awesome work. Yeah, 100%. Okay, next question is the massive opportunity question. So if you had $10 million in capital to build something ambitious, what would you make or build?
All right, so previously it was 5 million, right? So I'm going to pocket the first 5 million, and with the other... No.
The first 5 was for greenhouse. That was to see if you would do greenhouse again. This can be anything.
Anything. So if I were to get a blank check for 10 million and just start anything, would I?
No, what would it be? What would it be? I mean, you can't just pocket the money. What would you build? What would you build with a $10 million budget, let's say?
This question started off as a lot of fun, and it just got it took all the fun away. You know what? I don't know that there is a hidden treasure. I'm sure they're out there, but I don't know that there is anything other than what I started that I see as an actual need in the art world, right? There have to be more businesses that bridge the gap between secondary and primary market, because they're working as, opponents instead of collaborators, and there's so much opportunity there. So I don't know if I would invest the $10 million in something that is specifically devoted to that, with different initiatives that straddle both worlds. But I think that's where I would continue investing and pay close attention to.
I think it's totally fine to say I would take the 10 million and do greenhouse all over again. I mean, that's that's ambitious enough, and I'd be interested to see what it would look like with the $10 million backing behind it.
Me too.
Yeah, exactly. You're like, well, I know that my salary would look a little different than last time.
I should mention that greenhouse was completely self-funded. I did not have any investors. It was self-funded. It was on a shoestring budget. I used a big chunk of my 401k and my savings because that's how much I believed in the business.
I think it speaks to Shlomi Rabi, the person that at the beginning of this, he said, I never really thought of myself as an entrepreneur. I just, took my own money, started a business, did a bunch of successful auctions, sold it to one of the largest companies in the art world, went on to lead the global auction division for that company. But, I'm not an entrepreneur. What do I know? All right, last question, Shlomi, and maybe this will be a fun one. If you could steal one work of art from anywhere in the world and have it for yourself to keep, which work of art would you steal?
Oh, that's good. That is good. Wow. Okay, so I have a number, so I'm just trying to think of one. Which one above all else? You know what? I would have to go super, super conservative and old school, because it was one of the first works that I fell in love with from seeing it in a textbook. So back in, the 1500s when I was in college, we had this, massive phone book size art history books. And I remember coming across a pastel work that took my breath away. And it was by Degas. It was called L'Étoile, the star. And I had never seen anything so beautiful. And even though my taste has changed drastically since then, that is a work that I can absolutely credit with having started my love for the power of art and my appreciation of art to move you in such a way that nothing else can. And it was a poem unto itself. The composition, the colors for expression, the underlighting, the simplicity of it, the sort of if you look at it, of the form of the ballerina with her arms up and a leg up, it's so unconventional for a person to be portrayed mid-movement. It was very photographic in that regard, because that's what a photo does, not a painting. Paintings are usually a lot more still, especially from that era. But there was such vibrancy and such movement to it that I remember seeing it for the first time and just, gasping. I thought it was the most beautiful thing. So, of course, it's at the Musée d'Orsay. So sadly, it'll never come out for auction. And sadly, I will never be able to afford it, even if it did come out for auction. But it's certainly one that really launched my journey. So
yeah. Well, I was going to say for that story, I saw a headline just this morning or yesterday morning. Somebody bought a pastel that had Degas' signature on it, but no one believed it was attributed to Degas. Bought it online for only $1,000, and then it has been validated as a genuine lost Degas, and so the actual value of the work is something like $13 million, which
that
is
should be the person who we hit up to invest in our next $10 million.
It was amazing. But these stories, it's like it's the Antique Roadshow, juggernaut. But the work was originally listed in the online auction for $1, right? I mean, it was basically just someone who was clearing out. There was a pastel that they had inherited from a family member, listed it for $1. They went through a little bit of a bidding war, bid up to $1,000. The person took it away for $1,000, and then went to the auction specialists, and turns out, this is something that was lost during the Spanish Civil War, and it's a genuine Degas, and there it is.
Wow. I mean, the most expensive work to ever sell at auction, the Da Vinci of Salvador Mundi, was originally a salvage buy for only 10 grand. At the New Orleans House, because he was like artist unknown, 17th century German is how it was originally cataloged. But $450 million later.
Exactly. I like the greatest story I love about the Salvatore Mundi is it's the most expensive work of contemporary art, given how much restoration work was done on it.
I was working at Christie's when that happened, and we were watching the auction. I was with a contemporary team. We were watching it on a huge screen on the 6th floor, and there was a lag between the screen and where it actually was on the like if you're watching on a computer, but no one wanted to see what it was, and it just kept going. And at one point, someone peaked and just gasped because they reached over 300 million, and whereas on our screen it was like 110, 120, and it just kept going. So it was a 19-minute bidding war that was certainly one for the ages. But I've heard that before about the contemporary auction.
Wonderful work of contemporary art. Like whoever the conservators really should have had their names listed alongside of Leonardo's on that one, but good.
All right, Shlomi, thank you for coming on the show. I knew this would be a blast. So appreciate your time today and the stories, and of course we will talk again soon. So thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Take care.